Welcome to reading number 6 of The Hobbit, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Here's a quick recap of what we've learned so far. Thorin and his fellow dwarves have started off on a journey to their old kingdom to restore their wealth and rule. Bilbo the Hobbit, a nervous but brave companion, has joined them along with Gandalf the Great Wizard. The group is now entering dark and mysterious woods. And now, let's join Kathy Hughes from our Youth Connections program, who will take us into our sixth reading of The Hobbit.
Suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. "Now it is the burglar's turn," they said, meaning Bilbo. "You must go on and find out all about that light, and what it is for, and if all is perfectly safe and canny," said Thorin to the hobbit. "Now scuttle off, and come back quick if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl, and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can." Off Bilbo had to go, before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl, any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate hobbits can move quietly in woods, absolutely quietly. They take a pride in it. And Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all this dwarvish racket as they went along, though I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo, walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So, naturally, he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood, and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell, and there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls, obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that. From the great heavy faces of them, and their size, and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all, at all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton to-day, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again to-morrow," said one of the trolls. "Never a blinking bit of man-flesh have we had for long enough," said a second. "What the 'ell William was I thinking of to bring us into these parts at all beats me, and the drink running short. What's more," he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said as soon as he could. "Yer can't expect folk to stop here for ever just to be at by you and Bert. You're a village and a half between yer since we come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way, when yer have said thank yer, Bill, for a nice bit of fat valley mutton, like what this is." He took a big bite off a sheep's leg he was roasting, and wiped his lips on his sleeve. "Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only one head each." After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try roasted dwarf, or even pony, for a change. Or else he should have done a bit of good quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the trolls' pockets. It is nearly always worth while if you can manage it. Pinched the very mutton off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others more practical, but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings, he had heard of picking the Troll's pockets seemed the least difficult, so at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. "Ha!" thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. "This is a beginning." It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. "Are you?" it squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. "Blimey, Bert, look what I've caught," said William. "What is it?" said the others, coming up. "Lumme if I knows. What are yer?" "Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit," said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. "A burrow hobbit?" said they, a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake, and mighty suspicious about anything new to them. "What's a burrow hobbit got to do with my pocket, anyways?" said William. "And can yer cook 'em?" said Tom. "You can try," said Bert, picking up a skewer. "He wouldn't make above a mouthful," said William, who had already had a fine supper. "Not when he was skinned and boned. Perhaps there are more like him around about, and we might make a pie. Here you, are there any more of your sort of sneakin' in this here woods, yer nasty little rabbit?" said he, looking at the hobbit's furry feet, and he picked him up by the toes and shook him. "Yes, lots," said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friends away. "No, none at all, not one," he said immediately afterwards. "What d'yer mean?" said Bert, holding him right way up, by the hair this time. "What I say," said Bilbo, gasping, "and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I am a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper." "Poor little blighter," said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold, also he had lots of beer. "Poor little blighter. Let him go." "Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all," said Bert. "I don't want to have me throat cut in me sleep. Hold his toes in the fire till he talks." "I won't have it," said William. "I caught him anyway." "You're a fat fool, William," said Bert, "as I've said before this evening. And you're a lout, and I won't take this from you, Bill Huggins," says Bert, and puts his fist in William's eyes. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left, when Bert dropped him on the ground, to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs, and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms, and rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that of course only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round, so there he lay for a while panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight up came Balin. The dwarfs had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep toward the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarfs, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and "Sack Tom quick," they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. A sack was over his head, and he was down. "There's more to come yet," said Tom, "or I'm mighty mistook. Lots and none at all it is," he said. "No burrow hobbits, but lots of these here dwarfs. That's about the shape of it." "Reckon you're right," said Bert, "and we'd best get out of the light." And so they did. With sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire, and the spilled jugs, and the gnawed mutton, in surprise, pop, went a nasty smelly sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Filly and Killy together, and Dorry and Norry and Orry all in a heap, and Owen and Glowin, and Biffer and Bofer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach 'em," said Tom. But Biffer and Bomber had given a lot of trouble, and fought like mad, as dwarfs will when cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off, and said, "What's all this trouble? Who has been knocking my people about?" "It's Trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks," said he. "Oh, are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick as a young tree trunk, but he was sent spinning up into the top of some bushes when Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes, and so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry Trolls, and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and swash them into jelly. And Bilbo up in a bush, with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The Trolls had just decided to roast the dwarfs now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument they had all agreed to it. "No good roasting 'em now, it'll take all night," said a voice. Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William, and so the argument began all over again. And in the end they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a great black pot, and they took out their knives. "No good boiling 'em. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom's. "Shut up," said they, "or we'll never have done, and you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more." "Shut up yourself," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know?" "You're a booby," said William. "Booby yourself," said Tom. And so the argument began all over again, and went on hotter than ever, until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them, and boil them next time. "Who shall we sit on first?" said the voice. "Better sit on the last fellow first," said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking. "Don't talk to yourself," said Tom, "but if he wants to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he?" "The one with the yellow stockings," said Bert. "Nonsense, the one with the gray stockings," said a voice like William's. "I made sure it was yellow," said Bert. "Yellow it was," said William. "Then what did you say it was gray for?" said Bert. "I never did," Tom said. "That I never did," said Tom. "It was you, 2 to 1, so shut your mouth," said Bert. "Who are you talking to?" said William. "Now stop it," said Tom and Bert together. "The night's getting on and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it." "Dawn take you all, and be stoned to you," said a voice that sounded like William's. But it wasn't, for just at that moment the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood turned to stone as he stooped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds perch on them, for Trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains they are made of, and never move again. And that is what had happened to Bert and Tom and William.
Thank you, Kathy, for this reading. And I hope you'll join us for our next section of the wonderful book, The Hobbit.